think about Africa, you think about decolonization, about colonization. You think about this unstable government, this destroyed states. There are no big cities. You have this like, some people have this racist view that these are just like small villages where people just like farming and have no electricity and so on. But we think that this narrative, our narrative, is going to change. It is open mind of many people and see what is the actual status quo in Africa. See Africa, that there are big developing cities in Africa and greatly developing states in Africa, which are very much comparable to like Asia or Europe, cities that have like electricity, Wi-Fi, everything like that. And that they are basically local superpowers, like for example, Ethiopia, that are going to be, that can be like great future trading partners or like current trade partners that we can work with without just only focusing on the future and only seeing Africa as just like this state affected by colonialism. So once we are able to make this shift of narrative, it means that people are much more likely to focus on the future and see Africa as a trading partner, invest partner, rather than someone who just needs our developing aid to support them. So what are two arguments that we have in this debate? First, how is this outside view affecting Africa? So we believe that if you have this this view of colonial determinism, it means that you are much more likely on focus on like the aid without focusing on progress and future. Once you are able to go over this narrative, you are much more likely to help Africa in a way that is going to be beneficial both for you and for Africa, meaning that you are going to focus on investment, on building factories there, or buying the stocks of local factories or local firms in Africa, meaning that you are, for example, going to move headquarters of your firm to like Africa, some local headquarters, because you believe that Africa is no longer this like country affected by colonialism that we just sent aid to. You believe that this is the future market that will bring ginormous profits to your company. So you put, partial headquarters in this country, and you are going to invest much money into this country, meaning that you are going to create like working opportunities for many people in Africa, meaning that you are lifting many people in Africa also out of poverty into the middle class and upper class, meaning that what is actually currently problem is in Africa is that many companies don't necessarily have the money, they don't necessarily have the know-how, and this is something that you can bring into those countries and handle those companies. So by investing into those companies, you are creating profit on your side, but you are greatly helping those companies to become competitive and to actually be able to produce much more and much better things, meaning that you are creating like this, first of all, like richer people, middle class and everything, and these bigger companies. So for example, another example, if you have like just this development aid and you are sending, for example, this charity clothing to Africa because you believe these are just all the child crying that needs to help, what this actually does is actually destroying the local market structure. Because when you just sending this free stuff like free clothing and everything, imagine if you are a manufacturer of clothing in Africa, no one is going to buy stuff from you when they just can get this like free stuff from like West. So which means that you are going to go bankrupt and you are not going to make money and you will be all the time dependent on the West on those helps. Rather, if you invest in this local company that produces clothing, that is going to be much more beneficial to the society. Second point, how this affect like local policies and potential local politicians that can abuse this narrative for populism. We believe that there can be many different like cheap populists that are going to very much focus on this narrative of colonialism. And it is much so easier for them when this narrative is still in the society and is still the prevailing view to picture like white people as this like racist, slave owners that just want to destroy our countries. And yes, there are still going to be people that have this view anyway. However, we believe that under side of opposition, it is much easier to abuse this narrative to have like these cheap populist politicians. What this means that like the politicians that actually have constructive ideas and constructive policies, such as like good economical reform, are more likely to lose to this like cheap populism, because there is going to be a great support among people for these cheap populist practices that we just need to like, for example, take away money from the white people and like be more focusing on nationalism and themselves, meaning that you are going to first don't have the great reform that you could have if you just voted for irrational politicians, and you can potentially damage the connections and like trade relationships with other countries, meaning that the country that votes for this cheap politician is going to get more on the side of being poor and less developed. That is bad. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that speech. Now I'd like to welcome the leader of the opposition to introduce the opposition bench.
All right, I'll be going member now instead of Danyal. I hope that's okay. You guys on the chat would be great. Yeah, okay. Starting in, wait, can I start?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I have 3 pieces of extensive material which I think are really
I'll be
important,
going
and I'm
member
kind of
now
surprised
instead
they
of
came
Danyal.
forward in
I
this
hope
debate.
that's
First
okay.
of all, a bit
All right, sure. So I'll take POIs. I'll take POIs from the 5th minute. Feel free to interrupt me and then ask your POI. And because I might not be observing the chat space. And in case I've run my timer at 7:20, Judge, you can just stop me. I'm fine with that. So I begin in 3, 2, 1. I think that this debate needs to look at 3 things, which I'll be discussing. First of all, what does the theory say and what it means to support it? Because I think it has been greatly distorted in this debate. And then I'll come to my extensions, and which mostly is going to focus on why this discussion is necessarily important in the context of African development in the now. What is currently happening with African development and why we need this conversation. I'll talk about why this is extremely important in principle before looking at how the pragmatic effects come to play. So we think CG then moves to discuss more about this debate than other sides of the house, but they make a mistake in all of their analysis. The first mistake they make is that the discussion of colonial determinism in African development is not exclusive of other factors that hinders African development. So in the world where we are able to prove that you can still have conversations on this and take policies, like diplomats can take policies in that regard, etc., and still be able to deal with other problems, then Pano, you have no reason to vote for them over us. The second reason why that is also important is because when you examine the causality chain within the problems of African development, you can't be able to ascribe culpability on different levels to different actors. We think the identifying one actor as responsible does not eliminate all the other actors. But then, even if in the worst case scenario, what they are saying is totally true, we will still prove to you why, in this instance, colonialism is actually the reason why we even have bad leaders in the current frame. What would our extension focus on? Our extension focuses on the part that has been left within this debate, the context of development of Africa in the now. We are seeing the rise of neo-colonization in the sense of China invading the continent and taking up resources belonging to African countries. Western powers, for example, France, continuing to interfere in the politics of the people, and the influx of multinational corporations which continue to undermine governments, continue to pollute the environment, and engage in labor violations. We think these are the new forms of neo-colonialism or colonialism, and we think that in discussing colonial determinism, we think we create a sort of self-defense, and we are able to be more aware of the harms that are coming than we were when initial colonization began. So what does this theory say, and what does it mean to support it? It simply says that the influence and effects of colonization is long-term, and it is almost impossible to recover from, especially given the trend in which Africa is in now. And this is true for these structural reasons. First of all, the cultural change and influence. We think our language was changed. In that sense, our institutions were also changed. For example, the court systems. That means that the mass number of people who were illiterate are unable to access justice because they are unable to communicate within the official language, mostly because our educational system was destroyed. We think it came with the degradation of the self-dignity of the people. We were brainwashed to think that our goods and our products are not better, and that we need and develop an inordinate taste for foreign goods. That means that most of our people are not satisfied and do not believe they can achieve actualization here and want to move outside of the country. Second way is in economic damage, right? We think that we were oppressed into trading commodities and relying solely on our resources, even to the point where the world moved away from this. We were still trapped with incentives and economic structures that continue to ensure that we still engage in primary production and not refine them. We think also that global financing, in the sense of the way that it was done, continue to isolate Africa. We think things like currency control, like for example, France controlling the CFA within West African countries, are still ways in which we are being marginalized. We think things like structural adjustment programs like through the Bretton Woods Association continues to undermine and continually undermine our systems. We think politically too, it was done, and note this is what engages CG. It was done through the control of our leaders, funding of coups by Western powers, and also through economic sanctions, which limited the capacity of these leaders to be able to act in ways in which they could. And the institution of democracy, enforcing it on the people, even against their will at most times, meant that these people were unable to operate. So by supporting its pervasiveness in discourse, we support the constant reminder of our realities, because without assessing the damages, you can't mitigate against them. The second thing, which is our main extension, is without a constant reminder of this, you expose yourself to the harm of being colonized again. Why is this important? We think there is a new wave of colonialism, and how moving on from the initial one has set us up nicely to be fucked up all over again. In what ways was this done? First of all, China and their loan traps. We think their resource takeover by China, as seen in Ghana, where the Etiwa forest, vast mineral resource, bauxite mineral resources, has been offered as concessions for Chinese loans. We see this all over Africa. We've seen the influence that it has had on governments to be able to allow their corporations enter in here and trade, offering of large amounts of bribes and undermining the integrity of these governments and locking them up in loan traps, which forestalls the future decisions of even leaders who are yet to come in. We think the second way is by Western states supporting sponsoring conflict traps within Africa. For example, France supporting the dictator in Cameroon to keep the Anglophone part of the country with them so that they can still continue to access their resources and ship them off cheaply to France, right? We think by politically interfering in the process of Africa and setting up foreign policies like the Trans-Afrique, which continues to undermine the people of Africa. We think the influx of MNCs who are constantly exploiting governments, engaging in huge environmental damage and exploiting our natural resources by forcing these governments to give them tax cuts and havens, and also through labor violations, which continue to fuck Africa up. We think this has led to massive brain drain and migration, which is the economic loss of our resources and of our human capital. Yes, points from OG. OG. Yeah, I'll move on. Right. So why is this important? I'll move on. Why is this important? First of all, the principle. We think that in the constant reminder, there's acknowledgement of the harm caused by the moral guilt, and it causes the moral guilt and responsibility. We think that in itself as a principle means there is justice for the African people. By telling us to move on from this and forget about it, you ignore the justice part of it. We think the second principle is self-defense, because we make ourselves aware of the threats that exist and the ones that may come, and we try to get ourselves ready. We think that exists in two forms: to resist oppressors' rule and puppeteering from countries like China, but then secondly, to resist internal oppression of dictators. Given that the method of colonization was mostly through puppeteering leaders, we are then able to be more aware of this and be able to eliminate leaders who oppress us and continue to use excuses. We think that secondly, there are pragmatic effects in the sense that we are now able to demand for reparations. And mind you, this engages the idea that aids do not work, because principally we are entitled to those reparations. But we think then, even when we do not receive money, there are more structural changes that may occur in the sense of policies being much more moral and ethical in the way we are being treated. And lastly, the change in the educational system and our mindsets, which is likely to come in that instance to better prepare ourselves. Panel, vote on the principle, vote on the one who gives you the best pragmatic benefits, vote on the one who examines the current context and gives you relevance in his speech. Proudly closing opposition.
Thanks very much for that speech. Now I'd like to welcome the government whip to conclude the government case.
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah, you are.
Okay, fantastic. I'll prefer my POIs in the chat. Well, let me just get some water real quick. Fantastic. Starting my speech then in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Panel, I think this is a necessarily closing half debate, because I think the opening half of the debate missed the mark about what this debate was really about. Because whereas the opening half was just concerned about how specific Western nations are going to interact with this narrative and then lead to some nebulous impact of trade, the closing half is where this debate delved into the deeper characteristics of what the African development currently looks like, and whether or not this narrative is on a comparative better or worse for the African development and the way the African people interact with this narrative. Just quickly telling you why the opening half debate. I think Zainab has done a fair enough job to tell you why the opening half debated out, but I just want to crystallize it over here, and then I'll spend the rest of the time engaging with closing opposition. I want you to note the opening half, particularly opening opposition, rests their entire case case on Western countries suddenly developing a conscience eventually in a regrets debate and then giving you more money and reparations. Notice not only have they not done so by opening opposition's very own characteristic of Western countries such as Britain being indifferent or negligent or something like that, but Zainab has given you structural analysis as to why the Western countries to go towards these sorts of things, these incentive structures, like the backlash that they may receive if they accept the colonial past, Western countries, or that it will be very difficult, or there is very limited political capital to like heave all resources towards the reparative efforts given to the African countries that the opposition might wish to bring about. And given that the closing opposition does not extend on these specific ideas and instead introduces different parameters and metrics of this debate, I guess it's safe to assume that this idea is something that closing government in specific is winning on. Opening half is out. Now let's move on. To like the closing half in specific, which is what I'm going to spend the rest of this debate on, while also maybe offering a little more rebuttal to the opening half. I think the closing opposition brings two core ideas to us. The first is this idea, the social idea of the feeling of self being destroyed on our side of the house, and second is a more economic political sort of lens. Neo-colonialism is what they tagline it with, and then they introduce actors such as China. I'm going to show to you uniquely how Zainab's two extensions, being that of the academic discourse and its relation to society, and the second of the way the people interact with this sort of with this sort of discourse, helps us outweigh the sort of contributions brought forth by the closing opposition. I'm going to start first with the social lens over here, and I want you to know just how critical Zainab's idea of the academic discourse over here is. And remember, I want to remind the panel and crystallize this, that the pervasiveness of this particular discourse is mutually exclusive from just the acknowledgement of colonialism. This isn't to say that on our side of the house we won't accept that colonialism happened, or that it didn't like play a part in the sort of history that's taken place for African development. But I think what's unique and the thing that we regret is how pervasive it has become, particularly in the way it is discussed in academic context, or like technocrats discussing it with other academics and experts about the particular sort of influence colonialism has on the development of socio-political development in an African country. Because remember, I think the thing we regret the most is how it overrides everything else. Perhaps it could be current political structures that weaken the African development. Perhaps it could be sudden current bad economic policies that weaken the African development. But because the overriding mechanism of this discourse is colonialism, it is very difficult for the technocratic bubble within African countries to be able to look past the colonial past, and oftentimes most of it is usually just linked back to the colonial past. We think this is regretful because it limits or stagnates the sort of development, stunts the development that these African nations would have otherwise had on our side of the house, where the focus would have included the colonial past. We're not saying we're going to erase it, but it would also have a greater focus on what current developments are and what can currently be done to improve the existing status quo within African nations. And I want you to note the way the academic discourse trickles down to the social fabric of society is that many people is like when it's like presented in the news, or like when people discuss it on air and people watch it on TV or wherever they get this information disseminated from. That is the point at which their interaction with colonialism changes. That is the point at which their interpretation of what their country looks like, the past of what it looks like, and what the future could possibly hold, changes. I think this is where I want to engage directly with their idea of people feeling that their sense of self-worth is destroyed and coming from the closing opposition. I think it is uniquely worse in a world where colonial determinism is the pervasive element of this sort of social imagination, or the frame in which people interact in society. So I think the point at which the majority or the overriding idea they are presented is that their colonial past is irredeemably linked to their current economic woes, or that everything they do from this point on, or for like at least for the foreseeable future, is something that has been shattered because of the colonial past their ancestors experienced. I think that is the point. The ability to reconstruct their identity is significantly diminished, because identity reconstruction requires them to go beyond these specific ideas to imagine what a modern day Africa looks like. I think the point at which they're still stuck in the past in a majority of cases is when it is far more difficult for them to construct a sort of identity that is positive to them. I think this helps us outweigh closing opposition specific idea over here. What is the next extension coming from closing opposition, and which extension do I want to weigh up against that? There are the ideas of like neo-colonialism and like China taking advantage of you of different African nations. Over here, I want you to note the idea of nationalism coming exclusively from Zainab's piece. Before I expand on this, actually I'll take the POI from opening opposition.
Many people in Africa feel uncomfortable with the social norms that are opposed to them. When they're not the social norm of them, but the social norm opposed to them, it is significantly easier for them to stand up against this. This also includes problematic politicians because they run by the way.
Okay. again, we're not erasing the colonial past. We will still tell people that this is a point in history that happened. Like whatever facts about colonialism exist, we will still be teaching them. I'm sure people will be able to recognize that this was a part of their history. But what we're saying is we regret that it has been the overriding part of their history, and that they are not able to go beyond these sorts of ideas and assess or evaluate where they are right now, or where they want to be to detach themselves from the colonial past. That is what we specifically regret. Anyways, the idea of nationalism over here, and I want you to know, opening government may have mentioned the buzzword of nationalism, but Zenab gives you the unique mechanization as to how this nationalism manifests, how strongmen in Africa have come to power in places like Tunisia or Gambia or Libya. The reason for that is the way people interact with this, because the way people interact with the West in this narrative is a self-defensive sort of interaction, a self-defensive sort of interaction whereby they feel attacked by the Western sentiment, and that's why they're legitimizing the sorts of strongmen who bring about this anti-West sentiment. This is also important to note that any sort of dissent from like the norm of anti-Westernism, for people who may say that some Western ideas are probably beneficial for us, those are immediately curtailed and scapegoated oftentimes. I think those are the points at which these sorts of developments are reduced. But notice, I think the point at which such a strong anti-West sentiment exists because of the self-defensive nature and strong men nationalist people coming into power, that is the point at which these African countries are more likely to pivot towards China. So if the comparative is where are these nations more likely to resist Chinese influence spreading, I think a world in which they are in which they tie their identity less to anti-Westernism and more about their own internal development is the point at which they are more able to objectively assess whether or not China's encroachment within their lands is a good or bad thing. I think this is important to note, because the point at which this anti-West sentiment exists so strongly, that is the point at which they pivot to China more, because they see China as another anti-West actor. This allows us to outweigh closing opposition's second major contribution and take this debate. Thank you.
Okay.